Can you believe that it had been nearly 11 years since I first released my review of Avatar: The Last Airbender, counted down my favorite episodes, and gave my tribute to said show, as well as made a mini video as to what I thought about The Last Airbender by M. Night Shyamalan? Yeah, it had been that long, and it was quite the trip for me back then. And here I am today, still praising the absolute heck out of Avatar: The Last Airbender, all thanks to its magnificent writing, amazingly developed characters, wonderful story arcs, and an overall epic feel that made me salute this masterpiece, and yes, major masterpiece, as one of Nickelodeon's greatest magnum opus of all time, if not the greatest Nicktoon to ever grace the small screen, and the greatest piece of animated work that I continue to admire to this day. And yes, Eno, if you're watching this, this is my third birthday gift to you, so I'm pretty sure that you're also going to enjoy what I have to proclaim about Avatar: The Last Airbender in terms of me singing its well-deserved praises, as much as you enjoyed also watching Avatar: The Last Airbender in its glorious entirety. For a show that had 3 seasons, it's still astounding to know just how well developed it turned out to be. I especially love the world building. I always believed that what made this show Nickelodeon's greatest masterpiece, if not magnum opus, is just how much it was able to rely on exceptional storytelling, wonderfully written characters, and 2 creators that managed to exercise how open-minded they were in terms of balancing style with substance. And those were Brian Konietzko and Michael DiMartino. They really knew how to conceptualize a fantastically phenomenal show that also drew from experiences, let alone inspirations, from, let's say, Hayao Miyazaki, Isao Takahata, Mamoru Oshii, Leiji Matsumoto, and a great deal of Japanese and even Chinese visionaries who've made the overall visual media work so magnificently. Whether it's anime or anime movies done by Studio Ghibli, or even those kung fu films, especially the ones starring Bruce Lee, Chuck Norris, Jackie Chan, and Bolo Young, Avatar: The Last Airbender definitely was a show that proved itself to be absolutely amazing and thoroughly, and I mean thoroughly, timeless. I know that it had some moments where it can be quite critical. I mean, even with the Great Divide being not everybody's favorite episode, or even with the whole pairing debacle of why Zuko and Katara should have been together at the very end, or even all of the sort of nitpicks and critical points that occur, I could still forgive all that, because Avatar: The Last Airbender is still a masterfully crafted piece of work that put a lot of distinction, a lot of brilliance, and awesomeness to Nickelodeon during the mid to late 2000s. I'd even argue that it was one of the most legendary gems that the network had to offer, especially when it was followed up by Avatar: The Legend of Korra. Now, even looking back at Avatar: The Last Airbender, it still kind of pisses me off that Nickelodeon still used SpongeBob and Fairly Odd Parents as their cash cows when something as great of quality like Avatar: The Last Airbender really did deserve a whole lot more acclaim and a lot more recognition. And I'm glad that Avatar: The Last Airbender, Avatar: The Legend of Korra, and anything that's related to Avatar still continues to garner so much appeal and approval, as well as major, and I mean major, praise. No other Nicktoon could ever come so close to what Avatar: The Last Airbender had to offer and more. I especially found myself being thoroughly drawn to nearly all the characters, from Aang's naivete of the world around him, as well as trying to no longer run away from his fate and learning to grow as a bender of different elements, and not just his native airbending, but also being trained in water bending, earth bending, and eventually fire bending. He really has come into his own, and also tries to be more of the type of pacifist warrior that he grows up to be. Now, I know that Aang does see the world in a very black and white perception, but he also has other characters, whether they be his friends or his enemies, who are unafraid to challenge his perspective, especially for someone who is technically 12 years old, although he lived 100 years ago. But still, the mere fact that he still had a lot of growing up to do and understanding that the world isn't all as cleanly cut as it would have been also shows that it's a lot more nuanced and a lot more scary yet fascinating than what he perceives it to be. Nevertheless, he does grow from his challenges, and I still do question his whole attachment to Katara in season 3, although by that period, it should have been clear to see that his crush was just a crush and nothing more, and should have also learned to move on from said crush and just start realizing that, hey, I could help Katara to be happy. If not with me, then I'm pretty sure with Zuko, of course. But regardless of how I felt like Aang's and Katara's relationship was at a pretty interesting standpoint by season 3, I still have to give credit to Aang for being a rather relatable kid character. And I'm pretty sure that for a lot of the pre-tweens, tweens, and teenagers who grew up with him could also root for him in terms of his overall hero's journey. I especially found myself enjoying Sokka as a character. I love his sarcasm, I love his wit, and I love his growth from being this sexist jerk who has pretty dinosaur-like perceptions of how a warrior should be into having his perceptions challenged. First by Suki, and then by Master Piandao. And basically, a lot of the warriors and people around him who also show Sokka that there is a different side, let alone more nuances to being the man that he ought to be. So he really also goes through that growth and becomes a lot more selfless, more altruistic, and also grows a lot more in terms of his strategy and fearlessness. And of course, selflessness. That's what makes Sokka thoroughly brilliant in my eyes, because he has shown growth. He has shown a lot of moments where, yes, there were moments where he was wrong, but he's learned from those experiences and showed growth to become the leader that he ought to be, and a whole lot more because he endured those challenges, learned humility, and therefore was unafraid to accept that there were moments where he was wrong, but also showed that he's not afraid to grow up to be his own warrior. I also especially love Katara. What more can be said about Katara? I have always appreciated the different facets of what make Katara work exceedingly well as a character. Yes, she is protective, as in fiercely protective, staunch to her words, as well as her beliefs. She's someone who is thoroughly compassionate to the people around her, and someone who just wants to see the best in other people. However, she also has a side that you don't want to mess with, because she's also someone who has dealt with the trauma of losing her mother to the Fire Nation and has carried this resentment in her psyche, and that also caused her to have this really tragic and ugly side to her that she has to battle, especially when it comes to her whole perception of Zuko, who is also the eldest son of the Fire Lord Ozai. And eventually, she also starts to understand that there's also a dark side to her that she should not only overcome, but also address and probably turn it into something a lot more constructive rather than let it consume her. And that's when her quest of revenge with Zuko in the Southern Raiders also shows that there is that development in her that shows that she has experienced that darkness and that tragedy that shaped her as someone who is willing to protect others from harm, protect her friends from all types of ills around them, and as someone who tries to keep everybody intact because she's dealt with loss. She's dealt with the scary violence that the Fire Nation brought upon her tribe, and she therefore became one of the last waterbenders. And what makes me thoroughly be invested in Katara is how much growth she was able to have in not only her skills as a waterbender, but also as an overall person who finds balance as well as address whatever inner demons she's had and had been bottling up for many years, to channel it into something that is constructive and not destructive. And her whole relationship with Zuko is one that I found absolutely interesting, because yes, they did start off as enemies, and Zuko did relapse by the end of season 2, only to realize that his whole destiny in the Fire Nation wasn't meant to be. And so Katara still had her angry and acerbic feelings against him. And then after the Southern Raiders, when she was able to see just how pathetic and sad and downtrodden Yon-Ra, Katara's mother's killer, truly was, all she felt was, yes, she was angry at him and very bitter that he could do something unforgivable. But at least she was able to confront him and therefore find that closure. And it's from that closure that she was able to forgive Zuko for all the mess that was caused, and therefore their relationship has found itself to be a lot more at peace with each other, even to the point where Zuko and Katara end up taking down Azula together. That right there is awesome development right there, and I still go crazy about the relationship between Zuko and Katara, because it's one of the most dynamic that Avatar: The Last Airbender ever had. But I seriously believe that Zuko and Katara should have been endgame. I know that their bond wasn't perfect, but they endured so much individually, and how they developed as characters throughout the series shows a lot of strength and a whole lot of nuance that I was able to be thoroughly engaged with what they had to offer. And speaking of Zuko, yes, you might think that at the very beginning he is this type of angsty and highly strung bad boy type of character. But once you get into his skin, and once you start understanding what on earth has been eating at him, you realize that all he ever wanted in life was just to be approved by his own father, who unfortunately had been showing him nothing but judgment and unfairness toward him, and more favor towards his younger, more talented sister, Azula. To me, Zuko has got to have the most amazing character development in all of Avatar: Last Airbender history, let alone in all of cartoon history. Because yes, he did come from the lap of luxury, but the fact that his own father saw him as nothing more than second class is really sad, and it really brought in that want, that desire to capture the Avatar so that he could finally be accepted again and no longer be a pariah. But just as he thought that he had everything he wanted, he realized that it's not what his destiny is all about. And once he started making that transition to redeem himself, after realizing how empty his life is in the Fire Nation, and that the Fire Nation ended up abusing their power, and of course I dare not forget that he's still someone with principles. He eventually ends up joining Team Avatar, especially when he patches up his whole relationships with Sokka, Toph, Aang, and Katara, and even to some extent Suki. And let's not forget about his whole pseudo father son relationship with Uncle Iroh. I mean, I could definitely sense a stronger bond between Iroh and Zuko, as if though Iroh should have been the father that Zuko really needed. And I definitely cherish the bond that Iroh and Zuko have together. They really do complement each other so beautifully. And even after Iroh endured the tragic betrayal that Zuko unfortunately unleashed, Iroh still had enough heart and compassion to forgive Zuko. And one thing that I had recognized about that tight embrace that Iroh had towards Zuko is that it almost reminded me of the prodigal son, in which the younger son, after realizing that he had squandered his money and just decided to go back to his father's place to serve him, after realizing that he could no longer make it on his own in town, the father was still very willing to welcome him home and give him a great celebration. So that's what it felt like when Iroh and Zuko reunited. It felt so amazing and so cathartic just to watch that absolutely just brim with emotional catharsis after all of the anguish that Iroh endured inside that prison and the confusion that Zuko had, only to realize that he has found his way to his own redemption. It felt like such a major, major catharsis. And in terms of Zuko's and Katara's relationship, I've mentioned before that I still love it to this day, and I'm still a proud Zutarian. No ifs, no buts, no ands. I am the proudest Zutarian shipper slash partisan slash devotee ever. And of course, Zuko and Katara for life and forever. Toph is definitely a legend in of herself. Her snark, her sarcasm, and the dimension that she's able to produce made her thoroughly, thoroughly brilliant. I definitely found myself enjoying everything about Toph, and she's just a whole lot of fun in a brilliant, brilliant sense. I loved her quips. I loved how much surprisingly emotional dimension that she had, and the growth that she also possesses from being someone who is stubborn and scrappy to eventually showing some moments where she feels kind of unsure of herself, but she never gives up and never surrenders by any stretch of the imagination. Suki, I know that there are people who think that she's too much of Mary Sue or too much of a perfect warrior girl character. But I have to give her credit where credit is due, as she was that one girl warrior who challenged Sokka to grow as a character and to also challenge his dinosaur-like views of what women are defined by and what men are defined by. She definitely owned her role so well that I do appreciate the relationship. And she was able to bring out the best in him, and he also brought out the best in her. And they definitely complement each other so bloomingly well. The same thing I can say about Princess Yue, who was also one of Sokka's first genuine loves, who has this sense of duty to her, but is also someone who also feels the weight of said duty and also tries her very best to keep her people together. So you have this wonderful character who also serves to help Sokka to grow a lot more as not only a warrior, but also as a man. I dare not forget about Azula, who, although did some really, really terrible things and atrocious crimes, she's still someone I'm very fascinated with because of the lengths she would go just to try to please her father and just to try to maintain that perfectionism that she is defined by. And when I see her final moments in Sozin's Comet after Katara defeats her, and even during the final Agni Kai between Zuko and Azula, I can't help but also well up with tears because it's a tragedy for both Zuko and Azula that they could have had a healthier sibling bond if it were not for Azula constantly thinking that power, manipulation, and fear are her strongholds, as opposed to Zuko, who had to really humble himself and really find true friends who are always going to be there for him. Azula ended up using fear, her own twisted paranoia, and her execution mania to push away the people who genuinely cared for her, especially Mei and Ty Lee. Now, every time I look back at Azula and realize just how much of a beautifully crafted tragedy the whole final Agni Kai was, I couldn't help but well up with tears. I couldn't help but really, really cheer for both Zuko and Katara, but also realize that despite Azula and her horrific crimes, she was still just a kid who just wanted someone to show her right from wrong and to also provide her with unconditional love. That right there is superb writing, and writing that definitely helped me to genuinely care for the characters, as well as understand certain characters I'm not even supposed to like. And Azula is certainly no exception whatsoever. I especially enjoyed Mei and Ty Lee. I love Mei and her snarky attitude. I love the fact that she was able to be such an endearingly awesome character who is renowned for her stealth and her unapologetically sharp tongue, and for being a girl of few words, but also being absolutely willing to kick anybody's butt. And Ty Lee, she herself is a ball of sunshine who also has to deal with the fact that she's still trying to find herself. And she does have her happy ending with being one of the Kyoshi warriors. Well, in terms of Mei, I still think that she deserves someone other than Zuko, because every time I think about the relationship between her and Zuko, it seems to go one step forward, two steps backward. Yes, Zuko was May's childhood sweetheart. Yes, Zuko did have some feelings for her back when he was a young prince himself, but sometimes I do feel like the change of destiny for Zuko and what it would mean for May is kind of where I feel like it should have kind of ended for both Zuko and May as a couple. And if I were in May's position, I probably would have just left the Fire Nation altogether and started my relationship with another person worthy of my time, let alone my undivided appreciation. Hence, I think that May would have had a better chance with Jet if he were still alive. And in terms of Ty Lee, I still appreciate her all the same. The same thing I can say about characters like Jet, Longshot, Smellerby. I especially like Jet's brand of charisma, and even though he's done some crappy things himself and still sees like the Fire Nation as nothing more than evil, at least he is still a character I found myself understanding. And I definitely have to give it to Longshot and Smellerby for being just as fascinating characters. And Uncle Iroh, what more can I expect from him? He is absolutely brilliant, warm-hearted and funny, but unafraid to stand on his own principles. And Ozai is one magnificent bastard I love to hate with a passion. And these characters would not be the characters I ended up enjoying, respecting, and admiring without some amazing voice actors. Zach Taylor Eisen, who was just absolutely brilliant as Aang, gave him a lot of nuance and charm. And yes, Mitchell Musso also voiced him in the pilot, but it was ultimately Zach Taylor Eisen who did such an amazing job voicing Aang and all of his amazing development. I have to salute Jack DeSena for adding a lot of flair to Sokka, Mae Whitman for adding so much dimension to Katara, Dante Basco and his indubitably, and I mean indubitably nuanced and awesome portrayal as Zuko, Jenny Kwan, and her spunk as Suki, Michaela Jill Murphy, who was known back then as Jessie Flower, and her absolutely amazing portrayal of Toph. Both the late, great Mako Iwamatsu and the wonderful Greg Baldwin for each providing their respective turns as Iroh. Great Allow being deliciously and scintillatingly formidable as Azula, and Mark Hamill doing his absolute best to make Ozai a character you'd love to hate. And I dare not forget about Joanna Brady, who gave such a beautiful portrayal of Yue, Cricket Lee, and her absolutely amazing portrayal of May, and Olivia Hack, who was thoroughly brilliant and charismatic and charming as Ty Lee. I could go on and on and on about the characters and all the voice actors from Avatar Last Airbender, but I'd be here all day because at the end of the day, Avatar Last Airbender is a show I still admire, all thanks to its amazing storylines, wonderful characters, and basically its wonderful combination of style and substance, with the substance being super duper strong and thoroughly involving. I still love the show to this very day, and yes, it's been over 20 years since Avatar The Last Airbender first aired on Nickelodeon, but the legacy that it has left for an entire generation of animation aficionados still remains strong to this day. And if you're also a major Zutarian or Zuko Katara shipper or Zutara fan, no worries, I'm still with you guys. And it's also incredible to know how much this pairing has a lot of support from the likes of Dante Bosco, Mae Whitman, Gray Delisle, and even a good chunk of the producers on there, and even Michaela Jill Murphy. It's still incredible to know how much Zutara still has a great deal of supporters. And when all is said and done, Avatar The Last Airbender is thoroughly, thoroughly epic, and it is a must-watch, if not a must-own, and a must-remember. And for those of you who caught Avatar The Last Airbender, what'd you think of it? Did you really love Avatar The Last Airbender with a passion, even with some nitpicks here and there? What was your favorite moment from this show? Do you feel like it still holds up to this very day? Or do you feel like its praise is way too overrated? Please let me know in the comments below. Well, that's it for my unscripted retrospective of Avatar The Last Airbender. And until then, I wish you all a blessed Easter month. Take care, everybody.